Kanawipi.
Kanawipi, which means g'day in Eskimo, in Inuktitut language, Kanawipi. And we're here to share a little Arctic experience with you. How many have been to the Arctic? Oh, there's a couple. How many have been to Churchill in Manitoba, where it's the polar bear capital of the world? Well, that's where we lived, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So, Hudson Bay is a little picture of the Northwest Territories, and that red area is the area that I was responsible for, and Hudson Bay is in this area down here, the white area. Now, Hudson Bay was named after Henry Hudson. Ever heard of him? An English explorer who took a ship in 1611 from Bergen. I think they sailed from Bergen and they went into Hudson Bay. First white man in there. The Inuit and the Indians had been there forever, it seems. But Henry Hudson went in there and he was in trouble. He didn't get out quick enough and the sea froze over, so the whole ship's crew had to winter in James Bay, which is actually, if we go back to that map of this one here, James Bay is down in this corner here. They wintered in there, and then when they were looking for the Northwest Passage, which is up the top here through this red area, and they never found it, of course, and when they survived the winter, they decided that they wanted to, or he decided as a captain, he wanted to continue his journey, but the crew mutinied. And that's how you get to see him thrown into that little boat, set adrift with the sick crew. Anyone who was sick was put on this little wooden boat and they were never seen again. Although in 1800 somebody found a rock carved up on the shores of James Bay with his initials, HH, and I think it said 1612 or something like that. So he had actually carved his initials on a rock and it was later found. But the place where we went, to Churchill, was found by a Dane called Jens Monk. And he took a ship in from Bergen. Now, it's an interesting coincidence. Pauline and I were in Bergen, travelling around Europe and Norway, and we were heading off to Russia. We get to Bergen and we got a letter from the Northwest Territories government saying, yes, we want you to come to Canada and work for us. Because I'd applied and I never heard any more from them. So we were in Bergen when we got this letter. Coincidentally, 400 years earlier, Jens Monk was in Bergen and he set sail and he came across to Churchill, which is in Manitoba, Northern Shore. There it is there. Right. Can you see my little marker? Yeah, righto. That's Churchill. But he too got frozen in. He had two ships, a smaller one, a larger one, and they got frozen in. They had 65 men on board. And after the winter, only 3 men were alive. They had frozen to death, they'd starved, they got involved in cannibalism. As somebody died, they ate them. And 3 men survived. And those 3 men took the smaller boat and they eventually got back to Norway. Incredible. In fact, they've just had the celebration of 400 years since that happened. So we're talking about some white history in this area. Although the Inuit have been there for thousands of years. All right, well, we're going to carry on now and have a little look-see. What's available in Churchill? Well, if you're interested in travel, you can go to Churchill on a beluga whale tour. And it's also the world's capital for polar bears. And you'll see plenty of these fellas around. And if you go to Churchill a certain time of the year, because the bears come up to Churchill waiting for the sea ice to freeze over. So then they can walk out onto the sea and go fishing or hunting for seals. So that's why the polar bears gather. Pauline and I went from Bergen, we went back to London, we went to the embassy there, the Canadian embassy, to get our visas sorted. They said, sorry, you can't go to Canada, it could take 6 months to process this. Oh, they want us over there now, so I rang my boss in Canada. I said, you better talk to somebody because the immigration department are putting a block on us coming at this stage. So within 2 weeks we had a phone call from the embassy in London saying, please come in, your papers are ready. So it's not what you know, it's who you know. And he obviously knew the Minister of Immigration, who got on to London and said, you better get these two over here. We want them because nobody else wants the job. That's basically what happened. Anyhow, we went from London to Toronto to Winnipeg, and there we caught a plane, a DC-3. We're going back a few years, this is 1971, a long time ago. And there's the DC-3 that we flew into Churchill on. Took 8 hours from Winnipeg. Just kept going over tundra, over wetlands, and until we eventually reached Churchill on Hudson Bay. This is a shot in the winter. They normally land on the sea ice in the winter, but we arrived there in the summer, and what did we see as we rocketed up? Here's the aerial view of the little village that we were going to. Can you see these little houses down there? Just little log cabins. Back in 1971, they had electricity, they had sewerage, believe it or not. A lot of people didn't in the Arctic, but they had sewerage, and so that's where we moved to for the next 3 years.
They had lovely homes, as good as anybody's, but there was not a skerrick of dirt anywhere. We lived on gravel. So in the summertime there was gravel, summer was 6 weeks, and for winter there was no dirt because it was covered by snow. And if you walked in the house with snow on your boots, so what? It evaporated. So you really didn't need a vacuum cleaner for most of the year.
Yes, this is the clean-up in the spring when the snow all melts around the houses in the village where we lived. The kids are out on an emu parade, as we called it, to pick up the rubbish. And there's a saying in the Arctic that you don't eat yellow snow. And I guess you can work out why that is. You'll see a few artefacts up the front here. They have their own language. We've got a newspaper here somewhere that they never had a written language until the missionaries arrived. The Catholics were the first into that area, and they wanted to name them and teach them to writing, so they taught them this very strange syllable language that you can see on the top of that newspaper, which become then general across the Arctic. I don't know why they never taught them French or English, but anyhow they didn't. So they do have their own language. And by the way, you can ask questions at any time during our talk here today. I tell you what, the mosquitoes were pretty bad up there in the Arctic. This is one of my daughters. I don't know where you see her face just puffed right up with a mosquito bite.
Her first mosquito bite.
And she had a reaction to that. And then so we went out and the fathers got together and we built a mosquito-proof playground. And there it is there, to keep the mozzies off the kids. It was like landing on another planet. At midnight, the sun was out, so we could take the kids down the beach. And there's still ice floating in the harbour. That's midnight. That's the land of the midnight sun. Whole new world. And it was so hard to dig into the permafrost under the ground. You know, go down a couple of inches and you just hit solid ground. And so they couldn't bury their dead. What they did, they piled rocks on top of the graves, on top of the land. So that's a typical Eskimo grave. That's how difficult it is up in this strange land. But also the flowers were just beautiful in the summertime. Very short summer. Tell us about it.
A 6-week season from popping the first leaf up to flowering, fruiting, and then dying again. And the little cranberries are about the size of my fingernail, and we'd all go out with our plastic buckets and we'd pick cranberries, which were very sweet, but tedious because they were so tiny. Our eldest daughter at the time was 8, 9, and she found something she'd never seen before, and she said, "What's this, Mummy?" And I said, "Oh, that's the flower of a pussy willow," and it was about that far off the ground. 3 weeks later, she said, "I've got a sore nose." And I said, "Well, what's wrong?" And she said, "Well, there's something there." I said, "Well, give it a big blow." Out came the pussy willow. And I said, "What's that doing up there?" And she said, "Mummy, it doesn't smell." So she poked it all the way up to see if it would smell. But this photograph is taken a little distance from our home because there are trees there. We lived right on the tundra, so there weren't any trees where we lived. And And that was very different for when you're accustomed to trees, aren't you? Well, I was. And to live and look out of my living room window and not see a tree was very different.
Now, when I was there, I found some Eskimo clothing and tried it on. This is a caribou skin parka with a narwhal tusk, which is really one of their tooths. Ever heard of the narwhal? Well, here's a group of them here that you'll be surprised if you run into them. They use the tusk to dig into the ground and get molluscs and sea shells and things like that. But they're also an indication of their virility. They've done science is a wonderful thing. What they discovered, that the larger the tusk was the larger the testes on these whales. So that's a bit of trivia that we all need to know. How are we going? Here's Pauline with the. This is 47 years ago, and there she is with number 2 on her back. Number 3 is in her belly.
Well, you can't push a pram in 2 metres of snow. So I went traditional, like the Inuit ladies, and my neighbour that lived next door to me made me a mountic. She didn't use a tape measure, she used her eyes and she measured me with her hands. And we cut this out on the living room floor and she stitched it up, and of course this warm carried me and the baby. And if you notice, the hair colour has changed. I needed brown hair there so I could be seen. So this has got 2 layers. The duffel underneath, which is woven in Scotland, and
it's woolen.
Wool, but it keeps you warm. But you need to have this very thick cloth, duck I think they call it, to stop the wind chill factor.
Not quite down yet. There you better. That's better.
And I've lost my rope.
Oh, I've got to get the rope out. The biggest part of the day was spent getting dressed and getting undressed. When you went in the house, you've got undressed. When you go out of the house, you've got to get dressed.
So you put the rope on and tie it tight, and then you slip the baby down your shoulder so that it sits here in the back. I'll pull the, oh no, I can do it. And the feet go here, and the little bottom sits there. And the hood is like this so that, well, when the children get bigger, they ride and they sort of look out of here. But when they're babies...
They don't wear pants in the mountain.
They don't wear knickers. No,
Here's one little fella just been taken out of mum's, and he has not got his pants on.
So they sit on your back and you can feel every movement. So they burp on the back and they do everything else on your back, if you're not quick enough.
But the women know when they're going to do a wee, so they get them out quickly and put them on the snow. That's why you don't eat yellow snow.
So to get them out, you just hold the hood down like a chute and give a bit of a throw, and you catch them.
Catch the baby.
And then you quickly hold them out, and when they've finished, you just put your shoulder down, slide them in, give a bit of a jiggle, move their feet, and we're ready to go again. Breastfeeding's easy. Sleeves are big. You can just pull them around, shift the child here, move it across to the next one, pop it up, burp it, ready to go again. Ladies don't wear mittens, but we have our sleeves so that you can actually pull one inside the other to keep your hands ready to go. And if anyone wants to try it on later, they can. It smells of mothballs. But when you take it off, you just slide it on the ground, and the children know which is theirs, and they climb into it and have a sleep whenever they want to.
We fellas are a little bit less complicated. We just have a nice... Hers has got Wolverine.
This is Wolverine.
Yeah, this mine's got Arctic Fox on it.
It has to be natural hair, otherwise artificial hair freezes with your breath condensation and it will stick to your skin. So it's got to be natural fibre.
And this is a Wolverine one. Who wants to try it on? It's ideal for the sunshine. Where are you, lads? Come out here, mate. Bottle this. I'll hand it over the rope here.
So they still use natural fur, do they?
Yes,
Yes.
they do.
Oh,
They
yeah.
have to.
Don't they?
The
Artificial
weather
furs.
conditions haven't changed.
Yeah.
Wolverine's the best fur. That one on that jacket is the best possible because it doesn't ice up.
It also finances the hunters. So they keep
They walk around the front and show the ladies.
their hunting skills by catching the animals and selling them at a very good price.
So what did they use before the zips and all that?
Oh, they
They,
had big.
it didn't have an opening before. They just had it wide enough at the top for you to pull on.
They don't like to decorate their clothing with things like this.
Now the decorations, there are no patterns for these. The ladies just know the animals so intimately they can pick up a piece of
Thanks,
felt
Liz.
and cut the shape out.
That's a beautiful garment. They gave that to me when I left. It was my farewell present from the Inuit.
If only they knew.
Yeah,
It wouldn't be worn.
we can't wear it in Australia. Now I talked a little bit about polar bears. Well, this is the polar bear that came to the rubbish dump, and then he'd come round to our house and try to steal a bit of dog food. And I'm probably the only warrior in the world that's taken on a polar bear with a bucket of rocks. He would come to the back door and pinch the dog food. So I had this bucket of rocks in the laundry, and I opened the door and, "Get out of here!" and big throw a rock. He just flinched. But I don't think many people would tackle a polar bear. This one wasn't that big. As they get bigger, they could punch through the glass door and come in. They break into the supermarket and go straight to the cornflakes. Open the packets and get into it. They were such a nuisance, the polar bears of Churchill, that we used to trap them in big circular drums that had a drop cage on the end of it and put a bit of meat in there, and they go in and she'd drop down. And then they would fly them 200 kilometres away. But they'd be back in about 4 days. They just walk back. They know their way. They've got navigation. And then we catch, and if they become a real nuisance and threatened people or killed dogs or whatever, the RCMP would actually kill them. And on one occasion I had a heated garage for my car, and I went home to put the car away, lifted up the door, and there's 2 dead polar bears in my garage. They put them in there to keep them warm so the Inuit could then skin them and they could sell the skin. But gave me a bit of a shock to find 2 dead polar bears in my car garage. Oh, it's amazing. It's an amazing country. Here they are. They used to tag them, the polar bears, so they could keep an eye on them when they come, and they did a study on them and all that. Now, of course, it's a very different scene up there because you can actually go on a polar bear tour. And I know this is the armchair travel, but look at that. You're going up there on a tour and you can get into these jeep things and the bears will come looking for you. You can also go on a tour on the train up there, and that's one of the prize train journeys of the world from Winnipeg to Churchill. Takes about 20 hours, I think.
Yeah.
It's a long, I've done it, it's a long, long journey. And then you can get on one of these polar tundra buggies and go looking for polar bears. And they've made a big business out of it as far as tourism goes, and so people travel from all over the world to go on these polar bear tours. And I think they actually got 2 or 3 that hook together like a great big train that goes out. But look at the size of those bears, they are huge. You wouldn't want to run into one of them in the dark. I've got a lady here called Winnie Putuk. And when I first met her, she came from Baker Lake, I noticed she had a big scar on her neck. I said, "What has happened to you, Winnie? What's your story?" And she said, "Well, when we were little, when I was little, as her child is there, she said we were out fishing. And she said I was, in the summertime when the snow's all gone, the rivers run, and then the Arctic char, they go up the streams to spawn where they were born. What fish do. Anyhow, the natives knew this, and so they'd got rocks and they made sort of rock races in the shallow waters. And they'd just stand there, get the fishing spear, another one nearest you. They'd stand there with this fishing spear,
This one.
like that, and they would just catch these fish, they'd catch hundreds of them. Meanwhile, little Winnie is down the creek and she's playing with little rocks and she popped one in her mouth. And soon she's blue, she's gone unconscious. Her big brother picks her up, takes her straight over to Dad, who gets the hunting knife. This is a skinning knife. And he cut her throat, pulled the rock out. Then he handed the baby to her mother, who got out a bone needle and a sinew from the leg of a caribou was there stitching. And Mum stitched the neck up again, and she's still got the scar today to prove it. We're talking about a race of people who survived for 4,000 years in these Arctic conditions. 4,000 years they've been up there. Didn't know white man. And in 1953 there was an unusual weather condition called a Chinook. Down here we call it a bloody hot north wind. But up there it's a very hot south wind. And it came up over the Arctic and it melted the snow. It might have been that deep. And it turned that snow into ice. And the caribou would normally go around and just scratch through the snow and have a little munch on the lichens and the food on the ground. But the caribou could not get to the food. And so the caribou started to die. And the Inuit started to die as they were following them round. And the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, had outposts up there and they spotted this happening. And they sent a telegram, or back then it would have been over and out, a radio message to Ottawa. And in Ottawa in 1953, and now all of us can remember that year, the Ottawa government said, bring them into community. Get them off the land. They're going to die out there. And so that was the year that changed their life forever. And they were brought in, they were put in little boxes. So it wouldn't have been as big as that little box over there. And that's where they lived, and they had an oil lamp and so it went on. And eventually we got services to them. We brought in nurses, we brought in teachers, we brought in social workers like myself, and their lives were changed. So in 1953, some of these people were really quite primitive. They lived through the war, World War II, and the Americans were flying from Churchill over the North Pole to rescue and bring back the wounded from Europe. And the Eskimos wondering, what is that big silver bird up there? Tingmiho, Tingmiho. They used to call our aeroplanes that flew high in the sky over the Arctic, they called them Tingmiho, silver bird. They had no idea. Until 1953, they started coming in the community. We were there 20 years later, and they didn't have television. They didn't have jet planes. We went in the old DC-3. It was really quite old-fashioned. And there was only 3 planes a week into Churchill and only 1 plane a week into these outer-lying communities. But while we were there, the Americans put up Anak, Big Brother. A satellite went up into the sky. And from the satellite, if you had the right equipment, you could pick up television out there in the Arctic. And those days, that changed everything. Kids didn't go to school for 2 weeks. They stayed home watching the telly. And they all quickly got onto television. They got to that. So that's the skinning knife. Actually, it was the ladies that did a lot of that, so you can pass it around, but don't cut yourself.
Have they had another Chinook since then, like the hot wind?
I think they've had Chinooks, but not as bad as that one. That was horrendous for them.
Is that an Ulu knife?
That is. That's the Ulu.
You going to tell them what it's made of? From?
The blade is from a saw, a wood saw.
They pick up a wooden saw, yeah.
That handle is made with caribou bone.
And what did they use before that, before the myself?
Well, you can see over here some
Ivory.
ivory tusk on the end of a bit of driftwood made their harpoons, and the harpoon head is made out of bone and a little bit of this and that, and the ropes are made out of leather from the walrus. So they'd stand over the ice hole for up to 24 hours waiting for a seal to come up to get a breath of air. And then they'd throw that in, and the spearhead would come off and lodge into the animal, and then they would pull on that until the seal exhausted itself, And eventually they pull it up and they give it, always bent down and gave it a mouthful of water with a scoop up of water and put it in their mouth to thank the seal for giving up its life for their family.
And they still do that.
So there's some of the, there's a man up there that made replicas of their old tools for them. These had never been used, but they're nice replicas to teach people. But the whalers went in catching whales back in the 16 to 1700s, 1800s. The whalers went in there, caused a lot of problems, got a lot of VD, introduced alcohol to the Inuit. Just to get the girls drunk. And anyhow, to change the subject, this is Fort Churchill.
When the whalers came in, the local Indigenous people didn't have a name for them, but the whalers were pretty masculine young men, and so they called them kabloona, which meant you've got eyebrows on your stomach. So they had a lot of body hair, whereas the Inuit don't have body hair.
So we white fellas
So
have got
we
hair
were
around the umbilical cord, and they don't. They're a bit of Asian,
Mongolian.
they're Mongolian genes in them. Now that's a picture of Fort Churchill. The French decided they wanted to claim this territory, so they built this fort right on the top of the Churchill River there to stop any new shipping coming through, and they had cannons in there. But when you fired the cannonball would hardly reach the middle of the river, so it was pretty old-fashioned technology. And I think I've got a picture of what it looks like in the winter. There it is. That's what winter is at Fort Churchill. It's Pauline down at Fort Churchill. So there's a big difference, huge difference between summer and winter.